Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to give a presentation now, hoping to provide some knowledge and information. Yes, please.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نعتذر عن التأخير في بداية الجلسة لأمر خارج عن إرادتي. طبعا الجلسة تكون باللغة الإنجليزية، ولكن كتعريف بسيط بالمحاضر. Dr. Michael Mohavi is Director of Future Places Research Network and Senior Researcher at the Center for Future Places, KTH Royal Institute in Sweden. And also he's a noted author, speaker, strategist, consultant, and planner in so many different countries, USA, Latin America, and Europe. Because of the time that had been truncated from our speech, I would really appreciate if you can just resize your speech to 30 minutes. We originally had 1 hour and 15 minutes Q&A, questions and answers, but given the timing, I would really appreciate it if you can make it in 30 minutes. يا اخوان، المتحدث سيتحدث في حدود تقريبا 30 دقيقة، وبعد كده حناخذ الأسئلة يعني في حدود ربع ساعة، وإن شاء الله يعني ما ندخل على الجلسة اللي بعدها، بس we'll try our best. Please go ahead.
It's an honor to be here in this magnificent historic city and exploring such an important topic with all of you. And as I said last night, this is a momentous time for cities and for a more human-centered kind of development into the future. As my title suggests, I'd like to use this talk to explore the capacity of cities as engines, so to speak, of human well-being. And I'll start at a fairly broad level, exploring where we are now, and then I'll get more specific about a number of tools and approaches, and I know we'll be talking about that in the conference. I think we all have an intuitive idea why cities are important, why human-centered cities are important, but it's important, I think, to be able to gather up the evidence to show to those who are making decisions, and I think that's what we want to try to do in this conference. So I'm going to try to do that here. In fact, the evidence is stronger than we might think, as I'm going to discuss. And I don't want to be too academic, but I do want to cover a lot of ground, so please bear with me. I'll start by exploring an evolving science of cities as it's come to be known, and the new insights about why cities seem to work so well to promote human well-being, economic well-being, social, cultural, and the many ways that this can also go wrong, and that cities can fail to deliver on their great human capacity, and what we can do about that. I do think we're at a critical transition period, as Dr. Joan Clos put it when he was chairing the Habitat 3 conference a few years ago. And we do have some enormously hopeful new strategies and tools that are coming into our disposal now, which I know we'll be talking about during the conference. First off, when we think of the many challenges of our age, and we all know about depletion of resources, destruction of ecologies, pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, social and economic challenges, market instabilities, inequality, political unrest, and terrorism, and all the other issues that we face, it sometimes seems that cities and towns are the problem. Because that is, after all, where most of the human activity occurs that generates these impacts. But seen in another sense, cities and towns are very much the solution, and I want to explore that idea with you. I won't argue that the way we are building cities and towns today is entirely the solution. In many respects, it's not the solution, and we desperately need to rethink some of the things we're doing now. But I will argue that when they function well, when they're not fragmented, when they are human-centered, as we're talking about, cities have a marvelous inherent capacity to promote human well-being and to do it in a surprisingly economical, low-impact, and ecological way. The first thing I want to do is be clear about definitions. When I'm speaking about cities, I'm not only speaking about the big mega cities that are getting almost all of the attention these days. In fact, only about 1 out of 9 residents lives in those kinds of cities. And in spite of the growth of these cities, many smaller towns and suburbs are growing as well, meaning that the overwhelming majority live in and will continue to live in smaller cities and towns and in suburban areas as well. So it would be a serious mistake for us to over-concentrate our attention onto only the highest density cores of cities and to misunderstand what is happening and what needs to happen in the vast majority of urban settlements. As you see here in Vancouver, everyone talks about the urban Vancouver, but it's actually a very small part of the core. So let me begin also by pointing out this is what's going on right now. We're in a period of rapid urbanization around the globe. In fact, we're on track to produce more urban fabric in the next 40 years than we have in all of human history, and that is a staggering fact. This is Beijing in 2000, this is Beijing in 2009. The area of urbanization has increased fourfold. The density has not increased, the population has not increased fourfold, so the density is going down. Here in Las Vegas, you can see a very similar pattern from 1972 to 2010, a much, much larger urban area. And you can also see that Lake Mead is depleting the water level. And so you see a correlation between those two. Rapid urbanization is meaning rapid depletion of resources, and we have to understand that and get a handle on that. So there is some good news about urbanization and rapid urbanization. It creates many opportunities for to escape the problems of poverty, to have better quality health, economic opportunity, cultural opportunity, and so on. And yet we do have a problem with the functionally segregated and resource inefficient urban patterns in many cities today. It's really two sides. On the one hand, we have the explosive growth of informal settlements and slums. By some measures, 1 billion people live in informal settlements or even more. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the economic spectrum, so-called market rate development that is increasingly dependent on automobiles, segregated functionally and in other ways, and increasingly lacking in good quality public space. And I'm going to argue why this is a problem. You can see this happening right around the world in many continents, Asia, South America, India, Eastern Europe, Africa, and others. But we do need to recognize the serious issue, the reason that people are embracing urbanization, to overcome poverty and its ills. But at the same time, we need to ask whether our model is providing all that cities can: life opportunities, human development, sustainable growth, and quality of life. And my friend Mike Batty, University College London, put this, I think, very well, that we need to think of cities as places that bring us all together to connect to one another, to connect our resources, our networks of resources and networks of creativity and innovation that will allow us to thrive and grow. And this is really a different way of thinking, a deeper way, I think, about cities. And this is one of the areas of the new sciences, the network science, that I think is helping us to understand what's happening in cities, the way different people and different activities interconnect with each other in certain kinds of patterns that allows things to happen in more productive ways, more creative ways, and so on, particularly in urban networks built on public space. And I think everyone is aware of what's happening in the revolutionary insights from the sciences, from genetic science, from mathematics and computer science, the understanding of how complex patterns can be generated out of so-called algorithms and cellular automata and so on, understanding how some of these complex patterns actually get generated and how we can generate these complex patterns ourselves when we're doing things like working on genetic science and working on the genome and the protein structures of the body, understanding how form is created in biological systems and how it generates such an incredible variety of forms, partly through natural selection and other mechanisms, but also such incredible beauty and richness. And this is something that we are very interested in when we're talking about the human environment. So all of these things are pointing us towards a better understanding of cities as this kind of complex adaptive system and ways that we can act on cities, tools and strategies that we can use more successfully. As Jane Jacobs said, we can think about the kind of problem a city is in a more effective way. We can understand that it is what she called organized complexity. So briefly, I'll summarize some of the areas that we're really gaining a lot of insight from. Network science, I mentioned before, that gives us an understanding of how creativity and human development grows, especially in public space networks when we create contacts with one another. I'll come back to that point. Anthropology and sociology, this is the wonderful work that William H. White did. Fred Kent is here from Project for Public Spaces, and understanding how people interact in social environments, especially in public spaces. Mathematics and game theory, this is very important in economics right now, understanding how people follow rule-based processes to create certain kinds of outcomes. And if you want a different outcome, you need to change the rules, change the economic systems, for example. Learning about evolutionary processes and how form gets created, as I alluded to before, understanding how human environments, for example, have grown and transformed in very important, beautiful, sustainable ways. Understanding from cognitive, environmental, and social psychology. Very interesting work going on right now in neuroscience and in other fields related to that, about how human beings react to their environments. And often those conditions are not the ones that designers or planners or those of us who are professionals think are the good qualities. They actually, we tend to be off in our own silo, if you will. We tend to be forced to construe what is important for human beings, and often we get that very wrong, as construal level theory tells us. So these are important insights as well. And yet we're still in the grip of a model that's almost a century old now. The idea that technology is always going to provide a silver bullet for us, that whatever is newer is better, that reason is going to triumph over complexity and difficulty, that this will be political enlightenment, and that mechanical technology is a suitable ordering idea or an image or a fashion. And we're all beginning to recognize, I think, the weakness of that approach. But that approach evolved from the best of intentions, going back to the 19th century, when we recognized that there was another period of rapid urbanization, when cities were incredibly overcrowded, there was poor sanitation, there was disease, and many other problems. And the result of that was a wave of reforms, starting with a number of people, including Ebenezer Howard and his Garden City model that you see here, where everything is neatly segregated. You pull the parts of the city away from each other, and that's how you solve the problems. Le Corbusier, a few years later, formalized that in what's called the radiant city, where you pull the buildings away from the streets, and now the streets are only for cars. You don't have this mix of people in public spaces anymore. And that was thought to be a rational, suitable approach, and that's the model that we've been using for about the last 50 years or so, as you can see. Unfortunately, the problem with it is that you encapsulate everything. You destroy all those network connections that I talked about earlier. You have the capsule of your home and the capsule of your workplace connected by the capsule of your car, and you lose all the complex interactions and the sort of tissues of connections that you had in the old city. This is a famous drawing by Adolf Bayer, and you see what he thought of as the messy, dirty city on the right and the clean, orderly city on the left. But what you'll notice about the city on the left is that it is very rationally segregated. All the parts are pulled away from each other, and there isn't any real public space in the functional sense. There's lots of greenery and landscaping, but there isn't that kind of interactive place where people encounter each other and interact socially and so on. And this model was very popular in the early 20th century. It was a time of great optimism about the powers of mechanization and modernity. This was the World's Fair by an exhibit by General Motors in 1939, and it was an incredibly successful model. It made enormous amounts of profit for the companies at that time, and you have to acknowledge that. And of course, it was something that was embraced by the public. This is an advertisement in Life magazine in 1935, before there were any buildings or highways of that type. And you see on the right an area of Dallas, Texas that is exactly that way. And that's something that has had profound consequences for how cities work and how they relate to human beings and how we use resources. And so I want to argue that the framework for the best operating cities, the most optimal operating cities, is in fact public space, because it connects all of us together ultimately. It's the ultimate connectivity system. Yes, we have social networks, we have offices and conference rooms and meetings and conventions like this one and social media and all the other things, but they don't fundamentally replace, but rather they complement the fundamental public space, the fundamental city, the city realm. And there's a lot of insight into that. There's the great Herbert Simon in 1962 talked about the architecture of complexity, that yes, you can sort of pull apart the pieces to some degree, but they're nearly decomposable, as he put it. There are these tangles, these interconnections that are very important, that he called near decomposability. And the architect Christopher Alexander wrote a great paper in 1965 called "A City is Not a Tree," where he made the same point, that cities are about random encounters and overlapping connections, and hey, I met a friend who knows somebody who you should go talk to, and so on. The serendipity, as it's called. And as Alexander argued, this is really an important idea in terms of the structure of the city. It's not less organized, it's more organized. It's, as he said, thicker and tougher and more subtle and more complex view of structure. And Jane Jacobs, the great urban scholar, also made that point when she talked about the lowly, unpurposeful, and random sidewalk contact that are, in essence, the small change from which a city's wealth of public life may grow. And it's more than public life. It turns out to be economic wealth as well, as we're learning with economic spillovers, knowledge spillovers, and interactions, and so on. And so this is something that is good for everyone's bottom line. Exclusion of parts of the population puts a drag on the whole population, the whole function of the city, as my colleague Luis Betancourt has pointed out. Not only from policing and social services and so on, but from a principle in network theory called Metcalfe's law. The more nodes you have connected, the more things are going to happen, the more cylinders you're firing on, so to speak. And so we see this in our work at the Center for the Future of Places, which I'll talk about in a moment, that the public space frameworks are enormously beneficial and important. And that is something that is now embodied in the new urban agenda. As I think many of you probably know, it's a new document that was just adopted by acclamation by 193 countries, a historic framework agreement on urbanization, embodying many of the principles we're talking about at this conference. And it includes it's related to a number of other initiatives, including the COP21 climate agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And all of these, to one degree or another, embrace public space as a fundamental framework for urbanization. And I won't read through all this, but just to note, there are lots of passages in the new urban agenda talking about social and economic development, social and intergenerational interaction, health and well-being, walking and cycling, ecological, economic opportunity, and so on and so forth. In our work, I'm from the Center for the Future of Places in Stockholm, Sweden, and we've evolved from a partnership with UN Habitat and with Project for Public Spaces, who is also here today. And we've had a conference series where we've brought together many people internationally talking about these issues, over 1,500 people, including researchers and others, from 275 organizations in 100 countries. So lots of input into and comparing some of this research. And looking at gathering up this research, this is a new database system that we're developing that shows the benefits of public space and of human-centered cities, real estate value, health and restorative value, safety, sense of community, and so on. Our colleague Matthew Carmona at University College London has just created this wiki, which is a way of sharing evidence-based research on the value of public space and the value of human cities. And a number of white papers and other projects. This is a consultation I did for the city of Moscow when they were redoing their public streets and sidewalks and so on, and looking at economic, transport, social, health, environmental, and other benefits from public space. We need to be able to present this evidence, and when people are saying, why should I do this? Why should I spend this money that you're proposing? We need to demonstrate the importance of this network connectivity down to the level of the street and the public space for opportunities for social interaction, for economic development, and so on. And we can think of cities then as a kind of capillary system, like the capillary system of a leaf, where you want everything to be interconnected and you want the nutrients to flow around, and that makes up for a healthier tissue. And yet in the transportation world, unfortunately, we've made a terrible mistake, a tragic mistake, I would argue. We've taken a rural model of mobility and we have forced it into an urban setting. We've taken the arterial highway, which is a rural idea, that then branches off into the collector road and then branches off into towns, let's say. And we forced that into the city and created a system that does the same thing, and that instead of connecting towns, it connects neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods are now isolated entities with very fast-moving traffic around them. And this is a profound impact on the ability of cities to function, as I will argue in a moment. But this is the model that many people have embraced, the so-called Perry neighborhood unit in the upper left, the functional classification system on the right, which is the basis of many, many cities, certainly in the United States. The Phoenix, Arizona, for example, you can readily see this model. And the Garden City, which is an idea of segregating the parts of the city. Jane Jacobs, again, was very critical of this idea that people don't want to stay in their neighborhoods. They want to seek opportunities, and the fluidity, as she called it, fluidity of use and choice is a very, very important urban characteristic, to be able to have choices for jobs, goods, entertainment, ideas, and services. Jacobs also pointed out the damage that happens at the edges of these neighborhood units and other kinds of interruptions, that when this continuous fabric is cut apart, bisected or fragmented, then the result is something that's too weak to function properly. And so bear with me, I'm going to just walk through quickly some of her analysis of this, which is very interesting and I think still very relevant. She talked about two forms of land in the city. One is general land, which is the public spaces that we can all access, and then the special land, which is the private spaces and the buildings and the areas that are not able to be used. So you can think of it as a kind of matrix of the public spaces in the white lines there and the private spaces in the green. What you don't want to do is chop that up too much. You don't want to create small pieces that are too fragmented and disconnected. You want to have good connectivity across the system. You also don't want any one of those private spaces to get too big and also create problems at their perimeter, lots of fast-moving traffic and cutting off from the rest of the city. It's a little like if you take the leaf example again, and you have a caterpillar eat a hole in the leaf, you get a dieback not only right at the hole, but all across the entire leaf as a result of that. And that's very much something that we see in cities. For those of you who know the so-called space syntax analysis, there's a similar phenomenon where if you're mapping connectivity and you see high connectivity there in the red, if you then chop through with a freeway or a river or a park or anything that can disrupt, then you get a lower connectivity, and you often will see a dieback of businesses and activities there. You'll see, in some cases, the growth of a kind of slum-like condition as a result. So this is a very important issue for thinking about how to make good cities, good human cities, from a structural point of view, how to structure the transportation systems and the neighborhood structures as well, not to create these big disruptive units that are cut off from the surroundings. But this is exactly what we've done, of course, and the shopping mall is a perfect example of that, where everything is cut off, from you certainly can't walk really in that environment. You drive your car, you get out, and you go into the shopping mall at the center, and that's all you can do. You're not going to interact really until you're in the shopping mall. Ironically enough, this was Victor Gruen, the architect who developed this model. He was trying to replicate European villages, but obviously he made a profound change in the way that we settle our cities. Similar phenomenon with super blocks, so-called super campuses, like big industrial campuses and so on. And this is happening right around the world today. And yet what you see if you look at historic cities is a very characteristic pattern. This is Bologna, but I could show you many cities that are similar. And you can see the darker lines there that are the principal avenues that cut through the city that are the main transportation corridors, and then there are lots of other little capillary streets as well. And there's a very interesting pattern here, which is that there's a spacing of about 400 meters between these different principal arterials, principal avenues. And that turns out to be a very characteristic spacing that you see, as my friend Sergio Porta has pointed out. It seems to be related to the point when human mobility must give way to vehicular mobility, that sort of balance point where that's about the right spacing to do that. And that also creates a spacing, as Donald Appleyard referred to as a sanctuary inside there, which is quite small, much smaller than a neighborhood unit, by the way. And you see this pattern over and over again in many cities, even when the grids are quite irregular and deformed, you'll still see that same characteristic pattern. And you'll see it extending right out over otherwise interrupting structures like railroads, rivers, parks, many other potential disruptions, potential border vacuums as well. And so you'll see this pattern over and over. You can see it in a very rectilinear pattern, as you see a little bit in this drawing up at the top, but it can become much more informal and organic, if you will, or picturesque, as you see down below, but it still has the same spacing, and you'll see it over and over again. This is Paris in the inset in the upper left there. And I want to give you an example from my own hometown of Portland, Oregon, in the United States, as an example to try to give a concrete example of what can be sometimes rather abstract ideas. Here's the city grid of Portland, and once again you see about this 400 meter or quarter mile spacing of the principal arterials there. And they extend right out over the disruptions, including the freeways, including, again, the river, the bridges that go, that go across the river there. Quite remarkable continuity that extends. And here's a shopping mall. It isn't in a sea of parking. It's right in the center of the city with bridges and tunnels that maintain the connectivity to the surrounding urban fabric. Here's a hospital complex, very large, same thing, bridges and tunnels that connect, that allow the walkable street grid to penetrate right through. Industrial districts, same thing, many different sizes. This is becoming very popular for high-tech companies to locate in these kinds of walkable environments. So there's an important economic dimension there. This is our university, Portland State University, once again a continuous street grid extending through. And again, you have that continuous pattern, but you have also a range of street types and a range of degrees of mobility right up to the very high mobility freeway corridors. And those are handled again by being grade depressed, which is a very interesting and I think important idea. From the smallest little lanes and streets to the bigger avenues to the multi-way boulevards. This is one in Portland, also in the Portland area, with so-called slip lanes that allow lots of traffic to go through, more so than the avenues, and lots of parking and areas for cars. This is not anti-car. This is anti-letting the car take over the city. We want to tame the car and put it in balance with all the other ways of getting around, including walking and biking and transit. And again, there are the high mobility corridors like the freeways that go right into the city and that are grade depressed, that don't interrupt that walkable fabric. So I think this is a very important model, and it's a model that shows that a modern economic city like Portland, doing very well economically, can in fact be structured in this way. But we have to recognize the huge task ahead of us in Portland and in other cities around the world of moving from the city core, which often has that kind of pattern, to the surrounding region, which is a much more different story because it has a much more sort of fragmented pattern, and that needs to be knitted together. We're trying to do that in the Portland area, trying to create a series of larger city centers, smaller towns, and in between, and everything interconnected well so that we have that continuous fabric in the region. I think it's important to think in this way, so to speak, polycentrically, thinking about different centers of different sizes. And I'll tell you about one project that I was involved in as a project manager some years ago, which was to try to do that, try to bring more walkable urban fabric into an unwalkable area, a suburban area. And this was this area out near Hillsborough where there was a huge Intel campus that created 15,000 new jobs, which is a wonderful thing in one sense, but a terrible thing in the sense that it created an enormous jobs to housing imbalance. 15,000 people now had to drive long distances every day to get to their homes.
Michael?
Yes.
Can we wrap it up in 5 minutes?
Yes, let me wrap that up. I tell you what, I'll skip through this part. So I want to conclude by talking about some of the implementation processes that we need to think about. Jane Jacobs talked about the city as a kind of a process of economic gardening. We mustn't think about it so much as an act of carpentry, as an act of gardening. We need to cultivate. We need to enhance the things that are already happening, in many cases bottom up. We need to unite the top down with the bottom up in order to promote healthy urban growth and economic growth, and in order to understand the kind of problem a city is. You know, if you think about what a gardener does in a city, a gardener in a garden, a gardener finds and builds fertile soil, plants good genetic seeds, waters and fertilizes, prunes and weeds, and builds trellises and so on. And we, as urban gardeners, if you will, need to think along the same lines. We need to diagnose and improve conditions, develop new patterns and prototypes, find funding and incentives and other kinds of mechanisms, create regulations or reform regulations in many cases, create new infrastructure, new frameworks that will support the kind of bottom-up growth that we need. And we need to develop tools and toolkits combining all of these different kinds of approaches. So this is what I hope we can concentrate on in the rest of the conference, looking at some of these shareable tools and strategies, new kinds of codes, new kinds of financial mechanisms, new kinds of taxation mechanisms, ways of getting funding, ways of organizing, bringing business improvement districts and other things, public and private partnerships, strategic approaches, tactical urbanism, placemaking, and so on. And all of these things, I think, are here before us. They're fantastic opportunities at a historic moment that we have, and I think one of the best things we can do is to think about public space as a kind of organizing framework for all of these things. Thank you very much. questions?
نرحب بالمحاضر في مملكة الإنسانية. وسؤالي مباشرة رأيه عن أنسنة المدينة منذ عهد الرسول إلى العصر الزاهر، وما هي الصعوبات في أنسنة المدن، وما أشهر المجلات والخبرات في الأنسنة عالميا، وكيف يتم الربط بين المدينة القديمة الحديثة في الأنسنة العالمية.
I think we have enormous resources embodied in our cultural heritage. I mentioned this last night, and you see this here in Medina, certainly in all of Saudi Arabia. All over the world, there are wonderful patterns and lessons that we can learn from that are embodied in our heritage. Unfortunately, we threw a lot of that away in our rush to be modern, to be technological. And there was a great benefit in that, in some ways, as I alluded to in my talk. But I think one of the things that is happening now that is so hopeful is that we're learning, our technology is actually advancing in a way that's bringing it full circle back to some of the great timeless lessons of history, the great timeless lessons of our heritage and of our culture and of our religious traditions and our values. And so I don't see a tension between science and spirituality. I think in some ways science is enriching our spirituality. Certainly Islam is a perfect example of an embrace of science and learning and scholarship, and we've all been the beneficiaries of that. So more to your specific question about journals, I think there are a number of them coming into being developed now. There's a new journal on public space that has just been launched in partnership with UN Habitat. There are a number of journals that are beginning to focus much more on human beings and on using scientific methods to understand better what we know intuitively or should know, which is how people react to their environments.
Thank you, Dr. Michael, for this wonderful and informative presentation. And my question about the smart city and how it will contribute to the human city. As far as I know now, there is a trend in European cities that they are looking for a smart city. And to define a smart city, exactly, I need you to define the smart city and what does it mean exactly, and that how it will contribute to the human city. Is the human city should be a smart? This is my the other side of the question. You mentioned the old cities, the compacted cities, the simple urban fabric that connect people and bring them together in one place, and that urban tissue was not as smart as we understand the word smart nowadays. Thank you.
I think if we use the smart city technologies to simply add to what we're already doing, that will not be very smart. We really need to recognize that, yes, there's a place for technology and for these gadgets and so on, but there's also a place for rethinking what a smart city really is on a fundamental level, how it connects us together, how it creates opportunities for people, the things that I alluded to earlier. And so I think if we think of it that way, there is a great opportunity to use data, to use communications technologies and all the other things to support that process. But there's also a big danger that we're simply embracing a marketing strategy, to be blunt about it, of people who want to, for understandable reasons, want to sell their technology to cities. So we have to push. We have to push hard to make sure smart cities are truly smart.
Thank you, Doctor. I think there are so many layers to what you said, and you can't really, there's so many questions as well. We understand that green spaces, multi-purpose facilities, open for the public, and so on. People spend most of their time at work, and then they spend most of their time sleeping, and that bit of time, they probably go to the park and try to find areas. My question is, I believe it's crucial, and if you would agree and just help to expand on that, is that we're moving towards more big companies and employing thousands of people. We've lost skills. We've lost the fact that small and mom and pop shops and neighborhood stores, in the absence of all of that, then people simply have to drive into their car and drive to the Google offices or drive to, STCs and so on. How important is it for us to actually pay more attention to bringing back skill-based jobs, bringing back small and medium-sized businesses, and keeping that as part of the sort of ecosystem you're talking about?
I think we are focused a lot on the big companies, and they're certainly there, and in some cases they're perhaps bigger than it might be optimal. But there also are many small businesses that they don't get as much recognition. But for example, in the Intel example I showed earlier, Intel has a requirement that a lot of its subcontractors are within a certain range of the plant, and are in many cases much smaller. They might even be just single individuals who are working, to produce something for the company. So I think there's a diversification going on that's very hopeful. That you not only have the big companies, you have lots of sort of gig economy things going on, and people who are working out of their homes or out of small offices, or and those people do use public space quite a bit, and they interact in public space. At the same time, I think you're right. We have to push a little harder to make sure that small businesses are supported and that there's a diversity. One of the problems in many places is that the smaller shops that people need are being pushed out. For example, in tourist areas, you often will have only, tourist trinkets and stuff for sale, and the people who live there aren't being serviced by, what they need. So there are lots of, and I think that Jane Jacobs advocated this approach, lots of tools and strategies to strategically push back like a chess game to make opportunities for these other kinds of businesses as well.
There is a drive now to move to SMEs. This is the national drive in our own development plans.
Adnan Adas from Department of Architecture, King Abdulaziz University. Thank you for a good, very good informative presentation, Professor Michael. I have a very brief comment regarding, in your presentation you alluded to the mechanism, how to bring about this change.
Can you move a little closer to the microphone?
I'm sorry, okay. What is, in your opinion, the best mechanisms for local and city officials to bring about some of these changes that we talk about when we talk about improving the public open spaces? And as you've seen the examples here in Medina, the project in Jaddat Guba and some of the other projects in the informal settlement areas, this was brought about by very strong and positive efforts by local NGOs and philanthropic activities and stuff like that. But to really bring about the real changes and really impact the situation on the ground, we have a certain level of governments here. Local city government and local municipal officials maybe their hands are tied and straitjacketed by the regulations and the funding and all that. So in your experience, from your experience in global experience, what are some of the best practices that you've seen that brought about those changes in a very quick manner or in a very acceptable time frame? Thank you.
Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges we faced is what you have your finger on, which is that under the current set of regulations and requirements and so on, it's very limited what you can do. But I think the challenge we have is to think more strategically about how to actually change some of those constraints or work around some of those constraints. You could think of all of these things as a kind of operating system for growth, if you will. I alluded earlier to game theory and thinking about, if you move here and they move there, what do you do? And I think that's what we have to do. I think we have to find ways to either change the regulations that are constraining what people can do now, or find creative ways around those constraints, or simply find other strategies altogether and gradually transform the system that we have, the operating system. It didn't just spring out of nowhere. People made choices to create the system that we have, and we have choices now to make some changes. Sometimes they're incremental, sometimes it's frustrating. You can't change it all overnight, but you can stepwise, there are ways, and I think this is what's exciting about these new insights, that we have alternatives.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Doctor, and to welcome everybody in the room to talk about that great topic, which is definitely very broad and very deep and complicated, need many hours to talk about. But when I see your presentation, I realize the first or the second slide, you started with saying, or with a question, are cities the problem, or are they the solution? What a great question to start with for any government to understand exactly is the problem with the city that affect people, or people, can create their environment in their way, or it's very deep and need many research to be covered. Definitely cities cannot be built without people, but I think when we think about humanizing city, we should also at the same time talk about how to make rule or a system for people to deal with the facilities or with the public services or anything in the humanizing the city. And this is the point that I would like to mention also for the Ministry of Planning, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in any other country in the world, to start with the question, are cities the problem, or are they the solution? That is a really great start. Thank you very much.
I guess the point of that was that cities are the problem if we get them wrong. And if we get them wrong when we don't focus on the human being and on the most human level connections that cities can provide to us in our public spaces and in our, in our intimate contacts at all scales, public and private. And we have done that, unfortunately, over the last 50 or 75 years. We have allowed our technologies to be our masters instead of our servants, particularly the automobile, but also other forms of large-scale industrial development, and thinking that that was going to solve all of our problems. And it did solve some problems, but it created a whole host of other problems. So I think cities can be the solution if we reorient to human beings, and that's obviously what we're here to talk about.
Dr. Michael, it was a very interesting speech. You mentioned in your speech that to develop economies for a better life. Can you elaborate a little bit about this point, please?
When people come to the cities for a better life?
No, you mentioned to develop economies for a better life. It was a statement in your speech. I said, can you elaborate more about this point? You meant me to repeat?
I think I understand what you're asking. I'm a little uncertain how to respond, because I think perhaps what you're asking about is the relationship between economic well-being and other forms of well-being. Is that?
It was a statement in your speech to develop economies for better life. My question is, how can we develop economies for a better life?
Okay. I think that is a fundamental question that we should be talking about here at the conference. How can we reorient the economic feedback that we get away from things that simply deplete resources, like, selling resources to be burned or to consumed in other ways, to things that are more regenerative, that are creating long-term value, enduring value, buildings that last a longer time, places that are more beloved. And we need economic signals, economic feedback in order to do that. This is a larger topic than we have time for now, but the issue of so-called externalities in economics is a very important one, I think. How do we recognize the value of what I do for the quality of life of my grandchildren, or the value of the economic transaction I'm taking today to create a beautiful city that will exist in 20 or 30 years. Right now, I'm rewarded if I don't do that, if I simply build something quickly and sell it and leave. And so that we need to have economic feedback to reward people for long-term value. And there are some mechanisms and ways of doing that. There are bonds, there are obviously financial mechanisms that governments can take to create longer-term financial instruments. Again, it's a very big subject and a very important one, I think. And that's probably all we have time to say now.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. شكرا لك دكتور مايكل على هذا التقديم الرائع. السؤال يعني التحدي الأكبر في المملكة العربية السعودية المناخ الحار في معظم السنة في مناطق عديدة، أضف إلى المساحات الواسعة للمملكة العربية السعودية. كيف أو هل توجد تجارب دولية للتغلب على هذه القضية، محاولات لتحسين المناخ العام وفي نفس الوقت للربط بين الدول في هذه أو المدن ضمن هذه المساحة الشاسعة؟ وطبعا هذا الأمر حيكون مكلف بشكل كبير. الأمر الثالث، يعني ما هو رأيكم في الاستثمار للطبيعة لتحقيق الرفاهية؟ يعني الجبال، الصحراء، المزارع، الحارات قد تكون أنسب في الأماكن المقدسة مثل المدينة المنورة ومكة المكرمة. شكرا لكم.
Of course, every city has its different climate conditions, and there are very, very cold climates that you have to deal with those issues. There are very rainy climates, like my home city of Portland, Oregon, and we have to deal with those issues. I lived in Phoenix, Arizona in the United States when I was teaching there at the university, and that is a similar hot climate. So what I think we need to do is develop tools for the different localities that also are part of a larger shareable set of tools that we can share with one another globally, so that Medina and Phoenix might be able to share tools for developing comfortable outdoor spaces. And you mentioned greenery, and that's a great example of that. There are also, as you know, water emitting devices and other things that can help to make people comfortable. There are also just some wonderful timeless designs that have evolved in hot climates. The narrow street, for example, with lots of shading and the opportunity to capture wind and ventilation and other things. So there are lots of tools and strategies, including within our heritage, within our traditions, that we should be capturing and sharing with one another. And of course, I couldn't agree more that we need to support greenery and vegetation as not only an environmental benefit for things like the heat island effect, but also something that helps to improve human well-being. And there's a lot of interesting research about so-called biophilia and the effect that vegetation and water and other elements have on people's well-being. So that's another whole set of wonderful tools that we have at our disposal.
We have more intense engagement by the female section. فالإخوان لو بس يصبروا لنا شوية، أعطونا بس دقيقة. تفضلوا.
Okay, السلام عليكم. Dr. Leila Masristino, thank you for your informative lecture. But I wanted to ask you, did you ever deal in a project with new cities?
The what city? Sorry.
Did you ever deal with new cities? I mean, like the planning of new cities?
Oh, new cities.
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, I just saw my friend Michael Sorkin here. We were involved in a new town plan in Ecuador. And a couple of other interesting projects. There's a danger in those because you don't have some of the sort of natural mechanisms that have created wonderful cities over time, the sort of evolutionary advantages of what you might think of as natural cities. On the other hand, lots of cities, most cities at one time or another were planned as new cities. And I think we can learn lessons from that about how to organize the framework. One of the key issues I think we need to recognize is there are too many debates about should you be bottom up or should you be top down? And actually what you should be is both, and you need to figure out how to do that.
السلام عليكم. Hello. رزان نزهة من نماء المنورة. Thank you for your talk. Having lived in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, for the past 10 years, which, as you know, it's a planned city. It's called the city of roundabouts because it's overly planned. So there are a lot of great public spaces. There are semi-public spaces where people of the same interest could find each other. There's also the nature side, which people could go for a walk in the bushes. There are also other cities that have a lot of public spaces which are a bit too manufactured, so people don't adopt those spaces. So my question is, how do you get people to engage with public spaces and adopt these spaces?
Well, I think what I showed earlier was a couple of the models that have been used for planning new cities in the 20th century especially. And then I mentioned Christopher Alexander's remarkable paper, A City is Not a Tree, where he criticized those models as failing to have this kind of interconnected structure that cities really need. And I think that's a very important point, that we need to make sure that there is that kind of characteristic in our new planned areas. And that doesn't mean you don't plan it. It means you plan it in a different way. You plan it in order to foster that kind of public space interaction, that kind of connectivity that I alluded to earlier, and that allows those sort of bottom-up characteristics to form more readily over time and to create a more dynamic kind of city. I think that's the right approach for new city planning.
الإخوان المشرفين على المنتدى قالوا لي أنه الجلسة انتهت، ولكن الأخ يعني أحرجنا برفع اليد. أتمنى يكون اختصارك مختصر جدا وآخر واحد، وأعتذر للجميع عن الإطالة.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. المهندس محمد عاشور من فرع وزارة الشؤون الإسلامية منطقة المدينة المنورة. في إطار شرح سعادتكم في قدرة المدن في منظومة الأنسنة، كيف تروا من وجهة نظركم دور المساجد كدور للعبادة ومراكز اجتماعية في تفعيل الأنسنة في الإطار المحلي؟
Very important. Very central in many ways. Obviously, it depends on the culture. In my home country, the United States, it would be churches. And they tend to be less important over time in the United States. But I think people are beginning to return to using churches as community centers, as places that they have community activities and community resources, and that is a very important kind of public space in a sense, or a semi-public space, if you will, that is integral to everything else that happens around the city. If you think about what a city is, it's a series of civic institutional structures and public spaces around it. So that's an integral part of the system.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. أشكر الجميع على حسن الاستماع والمتابعة، ونعتذر عن التطويل. الإخوان يعني نعلن نهاية هذه الجلسة، والجلسة القادمة أعتقد المتحدث الثالث. Thank you very much. Thank you.